You move through your days with your emotional gates left open, and it barely registers anymore. A careless word lingers longer than it should. A small inconvenience quietly reshapes your mood. Someone else's tone, someone else's energy, and suddenly your state of mind is no longer your own. It happens so subtly you don't question it, until you realize how easily your peace is being negotiated. And the unsettling part is how normal this has become. It feels like life is happening to you instead of through you. Like your inner state is constantly being adjusted by things that were never supposed to have that kind of access. Not by force, but by habit. Quiet, automatic, unexamined reactions that slowly take control without ever announcing themselves. Stoicism was built for this exact condition. Not to control the world, but to master your response to it. A steady mind in an unstable environment, not cold, not detached, just grounded, clear, deliberate. The kind of inner stability most people never develop, but immediately recognize when they see it. It begins in a space so small most people never notice it, the brief gap between what happens and how you respond. Everything is decided there. An insult lands, and something inside you reacts before you even think. A plan falls apart, and your mind rushes straight into frustration. It feels automatic, like there was never a choice. But that feeling is misleading. There was a moment, small, almost invisible, where everything could have gone differently. The problem isn't that the moment doesn't exist. It's that it passes too quickly for an untrained mind to catch. Most people live at the mercy of that speed. They react first, then reflect later. And by then, the damage is already done. Words they didn't mean to say, emotions they didn't intend to feel, decisions made under pressure that don't reflect who they actually are. It creates a quiet kind of regret, not dramatic, but persistent, enough to slowly erode clarity and confidence over time. But the moment you slow that process, even slightly, everything changes. You begin to see what was always there, the mechanism behind your reactions. That space between stimulus and response starts to widen, just enough for awareness to step in. You feel the impulse rise, but instead of acting, you observe. The tension, the urgency, the pull to react, and in that observation, something shifts. You are no longer inside the reaction, you are watching it. That distance is where control begins, not by suppressing emotion, not by pretending it isn't there, but by choosing what happens next, quietly, deliberately, because once you realize you don't have to obey the first impulse, you begin to see how much of your life was previously automatic. The reaction loses its authority. It becomes a suggestion, not a command. But even when you begin to master that pause, something deeper still pulls at you. Because what disturbs you is rarely the event itself. It's the meaning you attach to it. Someone ignores you, and it feels like rejection. A plan fails, and it feels like personal failure. The event is simple, but the interpretation gives it weight. And that interpretation happens so fast, it feels like reality, but it isn't. It's a story, one your mind creates instantly, then believes without question. And once you begin to see that separation between what happened and what you made it mean, you regain something powerful. You realize that not every thought deserves to be accepted as truth. You can question it, adjust it, replace it. And when you do, the emotional weight begins to shift. Situations feel lighter, less personal, less consuming. You stop tying your identity to every outcome, and with that, your stability deepens. You are no longer being reshaped by every external moment. You remain steady, even when circumstances are not. Then there's something even more subtle, something you absorb without realizing it. The emotional atmosphere around you, the energy of conversations, the tone of people, the quiet tension in certain environments. It all leaves a trace. You might think your state is entirely your own, but it's constantly being influenced. Slowly, quietly, consistently. Spend enough time around negativity, and it begins to echo inside you. Not because you chose it, but because you allowed it. And once you see this clearly, you can't ignore it. You start to notice how certain people leave you feeling grounded, while others leave you drained. Not because of what they say directly, but because of how they see the world. And that perspective, repeated often enough, becomes contagious. So you begin to set boundaries, not harsh, not defensive, just intentional. You become more selective with what you allow into your mental space, because protecting your state is not avoidance, it's discipline. And that discipline creates a kind of quiet stability that doesn't depend on the environment staying calm. Even if you guard your environment, there's another source of disturbance that follows you everywhere: your expectations, the quiet assumptions you carry into every moment, that things should go your way, that people should act fairly, that effort should always lead to results. And when reality doesn't match those expectations, frustration appears, not because something is wrong, but because something didn't go as planned. That gap between expectation and reality is where most tension lives. But when you begin to release those rigid expectations, something shifts. You stop demanding that life follows your script. You start accepting that unpredictability is part of its nature, and with that acceptance comes flexibility. You adapt faster, you resist less, you move through situations without carrying unnecessary tension, not because everything is going well, but because you are no longer insisting that it must. Still, there are moments when emotion hits harder: anger, frustration, resentment. It builds quickly, and in those moments awareness feels distant. Most people either explode or suppress it, but both lead to the same result: loss of control. The difference is only where the damage appears. But what if those emotions weren't the problem? What if they were energy, raw, intense, waiting for direction? Because that's what they are. And once you begin to see them that way, your relationship with them changes. You don't need to get rid of them. You need to guide them. You take that intensity and redirect it into focus, into discipline, into something that builds instead of breaks. And over time, the emotions that once disrupted you begin to strengthen you. Not because they disappeared, but because you learned how to use them. Then the mind does something even more deceptive. It leaves the present entirely. It drifts into futures that haven't happened yet, conversations that don't exist, problems that haven't occurred. And somehow, your body reacts as if they're real. Tension rises, focus disappears, and you find yourself dealing with something that isn't even happening. That's where anxiety lives, not in reality but in imagination. And the only way out is not through thinking, but through returning back to what is actually in front of you, your breath, your surroundings, this moment, because in this exact second there is usually no real threat, only a projection. And the more you anchor yourself in the present, the less power those projections have. You stop fighting imagined futures and start dealing with what is real. Underneath all of this, there is one more layer: your need for validation. The way your state rises with approval and falls with criticism. It feels natural, but it creates instability. Because if someone else can change how you feel that easily, then your state is not fully yours. It is being adjusted constantly by external opinions. And once you see that clearly, you begin to shift your focus inward. You stop measuring yourself by how others respond and start measuring yourself by how you act, your discipline, your integrity, your consistency. And when that becomes your standard, something changes. Praise becomes optional, criticism becomes background noise, and your state becomes steady, not because the world is quiet, but because you are no longer relying on it for stability. And eventually all of this leads to a wider perspective. Because in the moment, everything feels urgent, important, overwhelming. But when you step back, you begin to see how temporary most of it is. What feels significant now often fades quickly. A week from now, it won't matter. A year from now, it will be irrelevant. And once you truly see that, something shifts. You stop reacting to every small disruption. You start choosing what actually deserves your energy. You stop giving permanent reactions to temporary situations, and that is where control becomes something deeper. Not just managing reactions, but shaping perspective, seeing clearly, acting deliberately, remaining steady, even when everything around you is not. If you're starting to see that space more clearly, the space between impulse and action, between emotion and control, then don't ignore it. That awareness is where everything begins. And subscribing here is a decision, a small but deliberate step toward mastering your own mind, one moment at a time. Even after you begin to create that pause, even after you start to slow down your reactions, something else continues to operate beneath the surface. It's quieter, but far more influential, because what truly disturbs you is rarely the event itself. It's the meaning you attach to it. The interpretation forms almost instantly, so fast it feels like part of reality rather than something you created. Someone doesn't respond to you, and it turns into rejection. A mistake happens, and it becomes proof that you're not good enough. The external moment is simple, almost neutral, but the internal narrative transforms it into something heavy, something personal. This is where most people lose their footing again, not because they failed to pause, but because they didn't question the story that followed. The mind doesn't just observe events, it judges them, labels them, connects them to identity. And once that connection is made, the emotional reaction becomes much stronger. It's no longer just something that happened, it becomes something that means something about you. And that meaning is what creates the disturbance. You begin to see how subtle this process is. It doesn't feel like a choice. It feels automatic, almost factual. But when you slow it down, when you really examine it, a different picture starts to appear. The event and the interpretation are not the same thing. They arrive together, but they are separate. One is external, the other is internal. And if one is internal, then it can be changed. As Epictetus said, it is not things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them. The Stoic approach rests on this exact realization, not in a theoretical way, but in a very practical one. If events themselves do not carry emotional weight, then the power shifts back to you. It means the disturbance is not being imposed from the outside. It's being constructed from within. That's not a comfortable realization at first, because it removes the ability to blame circumstances, but it also restores something far more valuable: control. There's a quiet clarity in the idea that it is not things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them. Once that begins to settle in, you start to approach situations differently. Instead of immediately accepting the first interpretation your mind offers, you begin to question it. Not aggressively, not with force, but with calm curiosity. You ask yourself whether what you're feeling is coming from what actually happened, or from the meaning you assigned to it. And in that questioning, space opens up again, not just between stimulus and response, but between event and interpretation. That space gives you options. It allows you to see multiple perspectives instead of being locked into one. Maybe that person didn't ignore you intentionally. Maybe that failure wasn't a reflection of your worth, but simply a result of circumstances. Maybe the meaning you attached is not the only one available. Over time, this practice changes how you relate to yourself. You stop tying your identity to every outcome. Success doesn't inflate you as much, and failure doesn't break you as easily. There is a kind of stability that begins to form, not because life becomes predictable, but because your sense of self is no longer being reshaped by every external event. You remain consistent, even when circumstances are not. This is where emotional resilience starts to deepen, not as a surface-level calm, but as a structural shift in how you process reality. You begin to move through situations with less resistance, less internal conflict. Not because nothing bothers you, but because you understand where that disturbance is coming from. And once you understand it, you can influence it. This awareness builds gradually. It doesn't arrive all at once. There are still moments when the old patterns take over, when the interpretation feels too real to question. But even then, something has changed. You notice it sooner. You recover faster. You don't stay trapped in it as long as you used to. And that progress, even if it feels small, is significant. As this continues, your relationship with external events becomes lighter. Not careless, but less burdened. You engage with what happens without attaching your identity to it. You respond without over-identifying. You experience without becoming overwhelmed. And through that, a different kind of strength begins to take shape. One that isn't dependent on circumstances, but grounded in how you interpret them. And slowly, almost without realizing it, you begin to understand that what once felt like reality was often just perspective. And perspective, unlike reality, can be changed. And then there's something even more subtle, something that doesn't announce itself but quietly shapes how you feel without asking for permission. It's not an event. It's not even a thought. It's the emotional atmosphere around you, the tone of conversations, the energy of people, the constant undercurrent of whatever environment you step into. It seems harmless at first, almost invisible, but over time it begins to leave a trace. You walk away from certain interactions feeling heavier, more tense, slightly unsettled, and you can't always explain why. Nothing dramatic happened, no clear conflict, and yet something shifted inside you. It doesn't happen all at once. It builds gradually. A conversation here, a complaint there, a subtle tension that lingers in the background. You might not notice it in the moment, but later, when you find yourself feeling irritated, drained, or mentally scattered, it becomes clear that something has been accumulating, not from your own thoughts necessarily, but from what you've allowed yourself to be exposed to repeatedly. This is why awareness of your environment becomes just as important as awareness of your thoughts. Because even if you learn to pause, even if you learn to question your interpretations, you are still being influenced by what you consistently surround yourself with. And influence, when repeated often enough, turns into habit. It shapes how you think, how you feel, and eventually how you respond. There is a quiet truth that captures this dynamic with clarity. The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. But those thoughts don't always originate in isolation. They are often reflections of the emotional climate you inhabit, the conversations you engage in, the attitudes you tolerate, the energy you allow to linger around you. All of it leaves an imprint. And once you begin to see this, it becomes difficult to ignore. You start to notice patterns. Certain people leave you feeling calm, clear, grounded. Others leave you restless, distracted, or subtly agitated. It's not always about what is said directly. Sometimes it's the tone, the underlying mindset, the way someone consistently interprets the world. That perspective, when repeated, becomes contagious. This doesn't mean you need to isolate yourself or avoid all discomfort. That would be unrealistic and unnecessary. The goal is not to control every environment, but to become intentional about what you allow to influence you. There is a difference between encountering negativity occasionally and immersing yourself in it constantly. One you can navigate. The other begins to shape you. Boundaries start to emerge naturally once you understand this. Not aggressive, not confrontational, but deliberate. You become more selective about the conversations you engage in. You step away from environments that consistently drain you. You limit exposure to patterns that you know will disrupt your internal balance. And you do it without guilt, because you recognize that protecting your state is not selfish. It's necessary. At first, this can feel uncomfortable. There is often a subtle pressure to participate, to listen, to absorb what others bring into the space. Stepping back can feel like distancing yourself. But over time, the clarity that follows becomes more valuable than the temporary discomfort. You begin to realize that not every emotional current needs to be followed. Not every conversation needs to be entered. Not every energy needs to be absorbed. And with that realization comes a shift in how you move through the world. You are still present, still engaged, but less permeable, less easily influenced. There is a boundary that wasn't there before, not a wall, but a filter. Something that allows you to observe without automatically internalizing. This filter becomes stronger the more you use it. It allows you to remain steady even in environments that are not. You can listen without absorbing. You can engage without being pulled into the emotional state of others. And that stability begins to feel natural, not forced. Over time, your baseline starts to change. You feel less drained at the end of the day, less reactive, more centered. Not because the world around you has become calmer, but because you have become more intentional about what you allow into your inner space. And that intention creates a kind of quiet protection. It also deepens your awareness of responsibility, not just for your own state, but for the energy you bring into shared spaces. Because just as you are influenced by others, you influence them as well. The way you respond, the tone you carry, the stability you maintain, it all contributes to the environment around you. And this creates a subtle feedback loop. The more grounded you become, the less you absorb unnecessary tension, and the less you absorb, the less you reflect it back into your surroundings. Over time, you become a stabilizing presence rather than a reactive one. Someone who doesn't amplify chaos, but quietly neutralizes it. That shift may not always be noticed immediately, but it is felt. And more importantly, it is sustained. Because once you understand how deeply your environment shapes you, you stop leaving it to chance. You begin to choose it, carefully, consistently. And in doing so, you reinforce the same principle that runs through everything. Control doesn't come from eliminating influence, but from deciding which influences are allowed to stay. Even after you begin to shape your environment more carefully, even after you become more selective about what you allow into your mental space, there is still something that follows you wherever you go. It doesn't depend on other people. It doesn't come from the outside. It comes from within, and it operates so quietly that it often feels invisible. These are your expectations, the silent agreements you make with reality without ever realizing it, the assumptions that things should unfold a certain way, that people should act in ways that feel fair to you. That effort should always produce the outcome you had in mind. And because these expectations are rarely spoken, they feel justified. This is where most people misunderstand frustration. They see it as a reaction to what happened, but it is more accurately a reaction to what didn't happen. The difference between what is and what was expected to be. That gap creates discomfort. And the larger the expectation, the stronger the reaction when it is not met. It's not the event itself that causes the emotional disturbance. It's the resistance to accepting it as it is. This doesn't mean you stop planning or caring about outcomes. It means you hold those plans with a different mindset. You recognize that effort does not guarantee results, only increases the probability. You understand that people act according to their own nature, not according to your standards. And you accept that unpredictability is not an exception, but a fundamental part of life. At first, this can feel like giving up control. Letting go of expectations can seem like lowering standards or becoming passive. But the opposite is true. When you release rigid expectations, you are not losing control, you are redirecting it. You are shifting your focus from trying to control outcomes to controlling your response to them. And that is where real stability begins. Without rigid expectations, surprises lose their power to disrupt you. A delayed plan is no longer a personal inconvenience, just a change that needs to be adjusted to. A difficult interaction is no longer an unexpected offense, but a reflection of human unpredictability. Even setbacks begin to feel less like failures, and more like natural parts of a process that was never guaranteed to be smooth. This shift creates a kind of internal flexibility. You move through situations with less resistance, less tension, not because everything is going well, but because you are no longer insisting that it must. That insistence was the source of much of the discomfort, and once it's gone, what remains is a quieter, more grounded way of engaging with reality. Over time, this changes how you experience daily life. Small disruptions that once felt significant begin to feel manageable. You recover more quickly. You adapt more easily. There is less internal negotiation, less frustration over things that were never fully within your control to begin with. And in that absence of resistance, there is more clarity. You begin to see situations more objectively. Without the distortion of expectation, events appear closer to what they actually are. Simpler, less charged. And that simplicity allows you to respond more effectively, not from frustration, but from understanding, not from resistance, but from acceptance. This acceptance is not passive, it's active awareness. It's recognizing what is within your control and what is not, and aligning your energy accordingly. Instead of fighting against reality, you work with it. You adjust, you adapt, you move forward without carrying unnecessary tension. And gradually, something else emerges. A sense of calm that isn't dependent on things going your way. A steadiness that comes from no longer needing the world to meet your expectations in order to feel at ease. That kind of calm is rare, not because it is complicated, but because it requires letting go of something most people never question. And in that clarity, the same pattern continues to reveal itself. Control was never about shaping the world to match your expectations. It was about shaping your expectations to align with the world as it is. There are moments when everything you've practiced seems to disappear. The pause becomes harder to access. The clarity fades. And what rises instead is something stronger, heavier, more difficult to contain. Anger builds quickly, almost like a surge of heat moving through your body. Frustration follows close behind, tightening your thoughts, narrowing your perspective. Sometimes it's quieter, more persistent. Resentment that lingers beneath the surface, shaping how you see people, how you interpret situations. These emotions don't ask for permission. They arrive with force, and in those moments, observation alone can feel insufficient. As Seneca wrote, "No man is free who is not master of himself." Most people respond in one of two ways. They either release the emotion immediately, letting it spill outward through words, actions, or impulsive decisions, or they push it down, pretending it isn't there, forcing themselves to stay composed while the tension builds internally. Both responses seem different on the surface, but they lead to the same result: loss of control. One is external chaos, the other is internal pressure. Neither resolves the emotion, they only change where it appears. But there is another way to approach these moments, one that requires a shift in how you understand emotion itself. Instead of seeing anger or frustration as something negative that needs to be eliminated, you begin to see it as energy, not refined, not directed, but powerful. The intensity you feel in those moments is not weakness, it is potential. The problem is not the presence of the emotion, it is the absence of direction. When you begin to view emotion this way, the experience changes. The surge of anger is no longer something to fear or suppress. It becomes something to work with. You feel it fully, without denying it, but you also resist the urge to release it blindly. You hold it just long enough to decide what to do with it. And in that decision, control reappears. There is a quiet truth in the idea that no man is free who is not master of himself. That mastery does not mean the absence of strong emotion. It means the ability to remain steady in the presence of it, to feel deeply without losing direction, to experience intensity without becoming controlled by it. In that gap, you make a different choice. Instead of directing the emotion outward, You redirect it inward into something that builds rather than breaks. Physical movement becomes an outlet. Focused work becomes a channel. Creative expression becomes a way to process what you're feeling without being consumed by it. The energy doesn't disappear, it transforms. This shift also reduces fear. Strong emotions no longer feel like threats to your stability. They become part of your internal system, something you can navigate rather than something you need to avoid. And with that, your confidence grows. Not in the sense of always feeling calm, but in knowing that even when you are not, you can still remain in control. Over time, this creates a different kind of strength, one that is not dependent on external calm, but on internal adaptability. You are no longer thrown off by intensity. You move through it, using it, shaping it. And in doing so, you prevent it from shaping you in ways you did not choose. This doesn't mean every moment will be handled perfectly. There will still be times when the emotion moves faster than your awareness, when the reaction comes before the pause. But even then, the recovery is quicker. The awareness returns sooner. And the pattern begins to shift over time. What once felt like something that controlled you becomes something you can direct. The same energy that led to impulsive decisions begins to support deliberate action. The same intensity that once disrupted your focus begins to sharpen it. And gradually, you start to see that the emotion itself was never the problem. As this understanding deepens, you stop trying to eliminate strong emotions altogether. You stop expecting yourself to remain calm at all times. Instead, you focus on something more practical, more achievable. Staying aware, staying deliberate, staying in control of where that energy goes. And through that, a new pattern forms, one where intensity no longer leads to instability, but to clarity. One where emotion is not something you escape from, but something you refine, and that refinement becomes part of the same process you've been building from the beginning. Learning step by step how to remain in control of what happens within you, no matter what arises. There is another pattern that unfolds quietly, often without being noticed until it has already taken hold. The mind begins to drift, not backward into the past, but forward into what has not yet happened. It constructs possibilities, scenarios, outcomes that feel vivid and convincing. Conversations replay in advance. Situations unfold in imagined detail. Problems expand before they even exist. And as these thoughts take shape, something unusual happens. The body responds as if those imagined events are real. Tension rises, breathing shifts. A sense of unease begins to build, even though nothing in the immediate environment has changed. This is where anxiety finds its foundation, not in what is happening, but in what might happen. It feels real because the mind is capable of simulating experience with remarkable clarity. The future, even when it is only a projection, can feel as immediate as the present. And without awareness, it becomes easy to lose the distinction between the two. The imagined scenario takes priority over reality. Attention moves away from what is actually happening and settles into what could happen, what might go wrong, what might unfold in ways that feel uncertain or threatening. The difficulty is not just that these thoughts arise, but that they are often accepted without question. They feel like preparation, like anticipation, like an attempt to gain control over what is uncertain. But in practice, they create the opposite effect. The more the mind engages with these imagined futures, the more unstable the present becomes. Focus weakens, clarity fades. The ability to respond effectively to what is in front of you diminishes because attention has already been redirected somewhere else. As Seneca wrote, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality." At first, this can feel unfamiliar. The mind resists stillness. It prefers movement, projection, constant activity. Bringing it back to the present feels like slowing something that has been accelerating for a long time. There may be a tendency to drift again, to return to the same imagined futures that feel unresolved. But each time you notice that drift and bring your attention back, you strengthen something important: your ability to remain grounded. This does not mean you stop planning or thinking ahead. It means you stop living in those projections as if they are already real. You plan when necessary, and then you return to the present. You think ahead when it serves a purpose, and then you release it. The distinction becomes clearer. Thought becomes a tool rather than a place you remain. As this distinction strengthens, your awareness of the present becomes more stable. You begin to notice details that were previously overlooked: the pace of your breathing, the way your body feels in a given moment, the actual conditions around you rather than the imagined ones ahead of you. This awareness creates a sense of grounding that is difficult to disrupt because it is anchored in something real. With that grounding comes a different kind of clarity. Decisions become simpler, actions become more direct. There is less interference from imagined outcomes, less hesitation caused by scenarios that may never occur. You respond to what is, rather than reacting to what might be. And that shift alone changes the quality of your actions. It also reduces the sense of pressure that often accompanies uncertainty. When attention is fixed on the future, everything feels urgent, unresolved, incomplete. But when attention returns to the present, that urgency begins to fade. Not because the future has been resolved, but because it is no longer being experienced prematurely. There is a steadiness that begins to develop through this practice. Not constant calm, but a reliable ability to return to the present when the mind begins to drift. That return becomes easier with repetition. What once required effort becomes more natural. The awareness comes sooner. The redirection happens more quickly. And as this continues, the pattern becomes clearer. The mind will always have the capacity to project into the future. That ability is part of its function, but it does not need to dominate your experience. You can observe it, use it when necessary, and step away from it when it begins to create unnecessary tension. This creates a different relationship with time itself. The future is no longer a place you live in. It becomes something you approach when needed and leave when it is no longer useful. The present becomes the primary point of reference, the place where action happens, where control exists, where awareness can be applied most effectively. And in that shift, something stabilizes. The imagined futures lose their intensity, the body relaxes, the mind becomes clearer, and what remains is a more direct connection to what is actually happening without the constant interference of what might happen next. Beneath everything you've been working on, your reactions, your interpretations, your environment, even your ability to stay present, there is a deeper layer that quietly influences all of it. It doesn't show up as clearly as anger or anxiety. It doesn't feel as immediate as a reaction, but it shapes your internal state more than you might realize. It is the need for validation, the tendency to look outward for confirmation that you are doing well, that you are enough, that you are on the right path. It seems harmless at first, even natural, but over time it creates a kind of instability that is easy to overlook. Because when your sense of stability depends on something outside of you, it becomes unpredictable. Approval feels good, but it is temporary. It lifts you for a moment, then fades. Criticism, on the other hand, tends to linger. It holds your attention longer, shapes your thoughts more deeply, and without realizing it, your emotional state begins to rise and fall based on factors you cannot fully control. Someone's opinion, someone's reaction, someone's perception of you becomes a determining force in how you feel. This creates a subtle form of dependence, not on a specific person, but on the responses of others in general. You begin to adjust yourself, sometimes unconsciously, to maintain that approval or avoid that criticism. Your actions shift slightly. Your words become more measured. Your decisions become influenced by how they might be perceived rather than what feels aligned internally. And over time, That adjustment becomes a pattern. The difficulty is that this pattern feels normal. It blends into everyday behavior so easily that it rarely stands out. But when you step back and look at it more closely, something becomes clear. If your emotional state can be changed so easily by external feedback, then it is not fully yours. It is being shaped, moment by moment, by something outside your control. There is a quiet realization that begins to form here, that stability cannot be built on something that is constantly changing. Opinions shift, perceptions vary. What one person values, another may not. If your sense of self is tied to those fluctuations, it will always remain unstable. There will always be something that disrupts it, something that pulls it in a different direction. This is where a different approach begins to take shape. Not by rejecting feedback entirely, but by changing where your primary standard comes from. Instead of looking outward for validation, you begin to look inward for alignment. You start to measure yourself based on your own actions, your own discipline, your own consistency, not in comparison to others, but in relation to your own values. There is a grounding in the idea that the happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts. When those thoughts are constantly influenced by external opinions, that quality becomes unstable. But when they are shaped by your own standards, your own intentions, something steadier begins to form. Your focus shifts from how you are perceived to how you are acting. This shift is not immediate. The habit of seeking validation has often been reinforced over many years. It shows up in small ways, checking for approval, replaying conversations, interpreting reactions. Letting go of that pattern requires awareness first, noticing when your state changes based on someone else's response, recognizing when your decisions are influenced by how they might be received. As Carl Jung observed, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Once you begin to notice it, you can start to redirect it. Instead of asking whether others approve, you ask whether your actions align with your values. Instead of focusing on how something was received, you focus on whether it was done with integrity. This redirection doesn't eliminate feedback, but it changes its role. It becomes information, not authority. Over time, this creates a different kind of stability, one that is less reactive, less dependent on external input. Praise still feels good, but it doesn't define your state. Criticism still carries weight, but it doesn't destabilize you. Both are processed, considered, and then placed in context, rather than absorbed completely. This also changes how you interact with others. Without the constant need for validation, your communication becomes more direct. Your decisions become clearer. You are less concerned with managing perception and more focused on acting with consistency. That consistency becomes noticeable, not because you are trying to project something, but because you are no longer adjusting yourself to fit external expectations. There is a kind of quiet confidence that begins to develop through this process. Not loud, not attention-seeking, but steady. It comes from knowing that your state is not easily shifted by what others think, that your actions are guided by something internal rather than external, and that understanding creates a sense of control that is difficult to disrupt. This doesn't mean you become indifferent to others. It means you are no longer dependent on them for your sense of stability. You can still listen, still consider, still learn, but without losing your center in the process. That balance allows you to engage more clearly without the underlying tension of needing approval. As this becomes more consistent, you begin to notice how much energy was previously spent monitoring and adjusting to external responses. That energy becomes available again. It can be directed toward your own growth, your own focus, your own discipline. And in that shift, your internal state becomes less scattered, more contained. And gradually, something settles into place. A sense that your state belongs to you. Not influenced moment to moment by shifting opinions, but guided by something more stable. Something you can return to, regardless of what is happening around you. And in that return, the same principle continues to deepen. Control is not about managing how others see you, but about managing how you see yourself. And after working through everything, your reactions, your interpretations, your environment, your expectations, your emotions, your attention, even your need for validation, you begin to notice a deeper shift taking place. It's not tied to a single moment or a single technique. It's a change in how you see things altogether, a widening of perspective. Because when you're inside a moment, everything feels amplified. A small problem feels large. A minor inconvenience feels personal. A brief frustration feels like it carries more weight than it actually does. The closer you are to it, the more intense it becomes. That intensity creates urgency. It convinces you that what you're experiencing right now is significant, that it requires your full emotional investment. And without stepping back, it's easy to believe that. The mind narrows its focus, zooms in on the issue, and everything else fades into the background. Context disappears. Time disappears. All that remains is the immediate feeling, and it feels absolute. But when you begin to create distance, not physically but mentally, something changes. The same situation, viewed from a wider perspective, starts to look different, less intense, less permanent. What once felt overwhelming begins to shrink slightly. Not because the situation itself has changed, but because your position relative to it has shifted. There is a clarity in the idea that you could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think. It is not meant to create fear, but perspective. A reminder that most of what feels urgent in the moment is temporary. That the things that disturb you now often fade with time, sometimes faster than you expect. And when you hold that awareness, even lightly, the grip of those moments begins to loosen. You start to notice patterns. Situations that once felt significant become distant memories. Conflicts that once seemed important lose their weight. Problems that consumed your attention resolve themselves or become irrelevant. And this repetition reveals something important. The mind tends to overestimate the importance of the present moment, especially when it is emotionally charged. With that realization, a different approach begins to form. Instead of reacting immediately, you begin to zoom out. You ask yourself how this moment fits into a larger timeline. Not as a forced exercise, but as a natural habit. You consider whether this will matter in a few days, a few months, a few years, and often the answer is clear. It won't. This doesn't make the moment meaningless, it places it in context. It reduces the sense of urgency that drives impulsive reactions. It allows you to choose your response more carefully, based not just on how you feel now, but on how you want to remember this moment later. That shift creates a different kind of control, one that is less reactive and more intentional. Over time, this perspective becomes easier to access. You don't have to force yourself to step back as often. It happens naturally. The mind begins to recognize when it is magnifying something unnecessarily. The emotional intensity is still there, but it is balanced by awareness. You feel it, but you are not fully consumed by it. This also changes how you allocate your energy. Not everything deserves the same level of attention. Not every disruption requires a response. Some things can be acknowledged and released without engagement. Others may require action, but not emotional investment. And a few, only a few, truly deserve your full focus and effort. That distinction becomes clearer as your perspective widens. You stop treating every situation as equally important. You begin to prioritize, not based on impulse, but on understanding. And in that prioritization, your energy becomes more focused, more effective. You are no longer scattered across multiple small disturbances. You are directed. This direction creates a sense of calm that is different from simply trying to stay relaxed. It comes from knowing that you are choosing where your attention goes, that you are not being pulled into every situation automatically, that you have the ability to step back, assess, and decide. There is also a quiet sense of detachment that develops. Not indifference, but distance. You are still involved in your life, still engaged, still responsive. But there is space between you and the moment, enough space to see it clearly, enough space to prevent it from taking over completely. This space allows for better decisions. When you are not overwhelmed by urgency, you can think more clearly. You can act more deliberately. You can align your actions with your values rather than your immediate emotions. And that alignment reinforces the same pattern you've been building from the beginning. Gradually, your relationship with challenges changes. They no longer feel like interruptions. They become part of a larger process. Something to be navigated, not something that defines your state. You respond, you adjust, you move forward without carrying unnecessary weight from each individual moment. And as this continues, you begin to see that emotional control is not just about managing reactions. It is about how you frame your entire experience. The perspective you choose shapes everything that follows. It determines what feels important, what feels urgent, what feels worth your energy. When that perspective becomes wider, more grounded, more connected to the larger flow of your life, something stabilizes. The small disruptions lose their power. The temporary moments stop dictating your long-term state. And what remains is a steadiness that comes not from controlling every situation, but from understanding how little control those situations should have over you. That understanding becomes the foundation for everything else. Most people will go back to reacting, to letting small moments control big emotions, to handing over their peace without even noticing it. But if you've stayed this far, something in you is already shifting. You're starting to see the space, the control, the quiet power that was always there, waiting to be claimed. Keep going. Don't stop here. There's another video on your screen that will deepen this even further. Watch it and continue building that unshakable mind. And truly, thank you for being part of Stoic Journal.